Does the past tell us how we are doomed to repeat it? Or do we get to make our own choices in life? Let's talk about it with the theme of The Traitor and the Hero by Jorge Luis Borges today.
The ultimate question is Una the traitor and Crypto the hero?
There's something about Borges that is just so unique and magical. I was laughing. I thought the story was perfect in terms of its tone, because you have like that ambiguity of like, oh, it could be Poland, it could be Ireland, it could be anywhere. And then he's just like, let's choose Ireland. Say 24? Like he chooses something very specific, but it's like this nonchalant way of approaching ambiguity and repetition that I love about him.
Unlike the form of sword, where you don't really get the twist to the end, this one you get the twist in the very beginning. And that conspiracy theory, it weighs with you the whole story because you're constantly thinking of it. And you're constantly thinking, what is the next cliffhanger he's going to give me? And I think he does that intentionally on this one, of setting it up in the beginning. You worry the whole time, or you're constantly trying to guess, at least that's what I did, of who's the next figure that he's going to talk about. And then when he gives you the next figure of Abraham Lincoln or Julius Caesar, you're like, oh, that's great. Okay, I get that one now. And then you start trying to come up with your own historical figures of how does this loop continue out through history? And I caught myself at the very end thinking, who's the next one? Who's going to be the one in 2024? Because it's coming up.
Right. Well, to your point, I mean, we're kind of jumping around. Borges gives it to you on a silver platter of things to think about. He says, other facets of the enigma disturb Ryan. They are of a cyclic nature. They seem to repeat or combine events of remote regions of remote ages. And to your exact point, like getting excited about past historical events, right? How many times do we hear about how like history is doomed to repeat itself with like, you know, the rise and fall of empires and an overreach of imperialism? You have the pandemic, right? That just happened with the Spanish flu. And now 100 years later, we have COVID-19 to these like, even like something on the more minor level, like economic upturns and downturns. Like, you know, that with the downtimes come the uptimes. And there's just nothing that makes us imagine that cycle won't repeat, right? And here we have in this story, well, that's a familiar pattern, an unknown assassin, and then a conspiracy theory of what led to that assassination, right? In terms of JFK, in terms of Lincoln, that are even directly referenced in this. There's something to be said about the way that there is a hidden pattern in human nature.
And I ask you this question, do you think the patterns influence the next pattern? Think of literally a pattern like on a quilt. When you put it together, and again, I don't know how to do any of that stuff, but the square influences all the squares around it. And then those squares influence those squares. They're ripples in a pond. And do you think what happened 1,000 years ago is still influencing us today in this cyclical nature? And I think history, you know, obviously kind of proves that, but it's almost like that Talon idea of Borges' story of we can influence our reality only to a certain point.
So you almost have to start with, what is your worldview about will, right? Is the universe deterministic, where if X happens, the result will be Y, or you'll end up at Y, more or less? And that's not my view, but you almost have this deterministic view of history where you say, okay, if this is a pattern, right, where dictatorships start to get too controlling, and you have divides between like conservatism and liberalism and sort of things, where you start to see how, you know, the fall of the Roman Empire didn't come out of left field. Like, there were Greek and Roman like sages that said like, hey, this isn't going to go so well. We've seen this pattern before, right? That if you have a pattern that you can determine, and life truly is deterministic, then not only could you unravel the past the same way that we're trying to figure out, okay, Fergus Kilpatrick, you know, we know these patterns, so we're going to figure out how he was murdered. But then could you accurately predict the future if things were truly deterministic?
I think you could. If we look at the French Revolution, we can see so many similarities between that and ourselves today, and it's scary.
Do you think when these things happen, right? Like you talked about that quilt ripple. I don't know much about quilting either, but I thought it was a pretty good example. Do you think that French Revolution taught societies anything? To me, when I look at it, I think of it kind of like the Hegelian model of dialect, like in terms of you have a problem, you have a solution, and they kind of resonate against each other, and then the truth comes out, right? In terms of like the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, right? For those that are into Hegelian dialectics, right? You could probably talk more than I did because I struggle with him. But the idea is that you have these two competing ideas, and there might be elements of truth to each, and by combating them with each other, you have some of the truth come out. Like what wins is the truth, right? So to me, when you have like the divine right to rule, when you have a strict authoritarian rule, and then you also have free will, and you have democracy that are popping up, and free thought and freedom of religion, as opposed to a specific design and unity of religion, right? Do you think we learned anything out of some of these conflicts that seem to keep coming up, right? If we look at the Russian Revolution and everything, like there's similarities, but do we ever change them ever so slightly and learn from them?
I think we do to a degree. Obviously, we wouldn't be here today if we didn't, because we would have not evolved to the point that we are. The problem is I think that the past becomes ambiguous at some point, where in 100 years, and I've said this before, like you and I will be long dead, and all that will be left is a few memories maybe in your grandkids' lives, my niece's children's lives, and what these videos survive on whatever the internet is in the future. So to think about the even the Russian Revolution, and we talked about the French Revolution, but if we just go to the Russian Revolution, almost everybody from that time period is gone. We only have what they wrote to us and left us, which, are they trustworthy narrators? And the other thing I think about it is mistakes. Back to my quilting example, there's always a mistake. There's always a glitch. There's always an anomaly in there as well. It could be a person. It could be a thing. It could be a place. I don't know. It could be the sun hitting wrong on our planet. So I think the ambiguity of time passing, and after too much time passes, there's no connectivity any there, and mistakes, or, the matrix, the one, the anomaly, the person that changes everything and moves the ripple in the river.
If we tried to learn faster, better from mistakes, if we really are repeating history and we're doomed to make a lot of these same mistakes, why? Why do we keep making them? Why do we have to be told twice? Why is it we only learn the second time? In some ways, if we look at a Plato's form of knowledge, if that were to truly exist, the perfect form of knowledge, it can only, in our experience, be born from the past on some levels, right? Only through direct interaction with things, because of complexity, because of these chaotic systems that can't be predicted, and because of, things, the context changes too, right? Like the technology today is not the technology of 1917. There's a globalization that's happened that they didn't have back then, right? That the knowledge and awareness that we have always comes from the past, yet we keep going back to repeat these patterns of mistakes, because only once it becomes personal does it become real in some regards.
I also think that it's to the point of, yes, we have better technology, and everybody on the planet that has internet access has access to all the knowledge of all of humankind, which has never happened before. More people on the planet can read ever than before. The problem is that it takes people, and there's only so many leaders that are going to change those things. And the story talks about those leaders and how they are the influences. And today, our leaders aren't necessarily military or political like the ones that are mentioned in the story, right? Our leaders today are leaders of businesses, CEOs that are more interested in their own personal gain than maybe the people themselves. And I think that could be a really big difference of where predicting the future is more difficult now than maybe it was in the past.
So earlier you mentioned You mentioned a lot of things. We're covering a lot of ground really fast here. But we talked about some history books that we've read, and you hear the term "to the victor goes the spoils" or "the winner rewrites history," right? And in this story, we have some speculation, some conspiracy that says that, okay, what actually happened was that Kilpatrick was the traitor himself. He signs his own death warrant, right? And you had a really good point about the form of the sword being a good story to compare against, because in that one, the traitor lives with like this guilt and shame his entire life and almost self-punishes himself a la Crime and Punishment. But in this story, he rewrites history to be the martyr, right? By also, to our earlier point of realigning himself with history, by being the martyr and being celebrated, because in the past we have always celebrated the martyr, hence the historical repetition, historical recurrence, right? He then thus rewrites actuality, right? Intention is separated from action with this. And I think that's something that, you talked about the great man. I don't think you mentioned the great man theory, but I kind of started to think about that when you started to bring that up. The leaders, who are the leaders today? You had that book, War and Peace, which was an assault on the great man theory of who actually controls these deterministic events, right? And I'm personally a believer of free will. I do believe that the complexity of human interaction and technology and context changes why history isn't always the same. I think out of the Napoleonic Wars, we tested how far do we truly want freedom versus bureaucracy ruling us, right? Because what Napoleon promised and how he kind of actually became the emperor and forced his will upon others were two very different things. And he pushed it too far, I think, right? And that, again, is that pattern that we've seen again. And I think we've learned as societies that we wanted more choice. We wanted more free will and thought that human intention mattered more. And here, Kilpatrick, his intention, his will is literally rewriting his stance in history. And that's what I think is just crazy about this story is it's conspiracy. You start getting caught up with like the craziness of it. He has no idea. He's like years removed from this and speculating based on some facts that he read that his best friend just so happened to write for this trope, this troupe of actors that recreate historical events. Oh, there's that recreating historical events and our desire to repeat the past again. This is truly a fascinating story.
It really is. Two things. One, when you were talking about that, it got me thinking about when I used to do the Civil War reenactments. We would have, everybody could play either side, but usually it was 2 days, right? And on the first day, one side was allowed, quote, to win. And then the other day, the other side was, quote, allowed to win. So both sides got to win, and we're recreating some of these battles where there was a clear victor and loser, but we were rewriting history so that everybody feel like they got to win on one day. Everybody gets a participation trophy. I thought that was funny. My other thing that I was going to ask you, that what do you think would change of the story if we changed one little thing about this and the title was Theme of the Traitor or the Hero?
Well, first of all, let's dive into, because here's what I'm thinking of when you say that. The difference between and or are the truth conditions, right? In and, both have to be true, right? You have to be a hero and you have to be a traitor. You can't be one or the other. You have to be both. But with or, you only need to satisfy one of those conditions, right? But not the other. And if we're talking about this, we've talked about how many literature books have we referred to so far? Almost too many.
A dozen. Yeah.
Right. But doesn't literature have an interaction with life? Right. And a lot of times when we look at literature, it follows that model of, okay, here's a problem. and he has this way to solve it or that way to solve it. And you have to choose what's right. And usually what you're thinking is the right answer tells you more about yourself, right? So I almost think if you made it or, it would almost make this story more reader-centric of how do I interpret a traitor and how do I interpret a hero. But when it's and, there's something weird about how the way this story makes him both to society. But again, when we talk about Borges, we always have that agnostic knowledge, secret knowledge that only the elect and select few have access to. So only a certain number of people can have satisfied the and condition in this Borges story, which I think is, very Borgesian to put it.
The and for me, as I thought about my own question, is that it satisfies both sides of the story. If you're thinking of a war, one of the generals, Napoleon, he is a hero to his own people, and he is a traitor or bad guy to the other side. But he could be or to his own people as well. And I feel like that's what Kilpatrick is he's changed history from and to or, because he can be both to himself, but he can't be both to history. He can't be both to society. The way he's changed history.
Yeah. Well, and then, okay, let's bring up some more literature, right? The Egg by Andy Weir, right? That's that exploration where you have to live and relive reincarnated every single life, which means you've had to live the truth from every point of view where in your knowledge, you're smart enough to know that it's true. But to quote, I forget his name, but dumb enough not to realize that you're wrong in some circumstances. Like that's what you're living with this and is that in each circumstance, you think you're on the right side only to realize that when you live and change your context, it's different, which I think is that Hegelian exploration or even Marxian theory of over time, we learn and improve upon the past, even though we repeat certain patterns of it. Hence, why you could never actually truly predict the future other than some broad stroke things of like, oh gosh, democracy's failing, like that sort of thing.
Maybe not be able to predict the future on large scale, but maybe on smaller scales for what people's choices are going to be in the short term, I don't think is out of reasonable thought, because of if you look at patterns of people, it can become predictable, I think, to a certain point.
Well, there's always a traitor, right? To the point of this story, JC and Brutus or JC and Judas.
Judas.
Right?
Yeah. Well, there'll always be a hero too, though. It's a double-edged coin, right? I mean, we've thrown out so many analogies and references here, but it's that thin line between love and hate, or friendship and enemy. You have to have light to have darkness. You have to have darkness to have light, and this story kind of encapsulates all of that perfectly. Well done, Borges. Another 10 out of 10 if we still did numbers.
Et tu, Brute. What did you think of this story? Hit us up with an emoji down below if you enjoyed the conversation and weren't sure what to add. It helps the algorithm know that you did enjoy the story and helps us out greatly. We're going to leave a playlist of other Borges talks we've had down below. Feel free to check those out. We appreciate you spending time with us today. My name's been Una. Peace.
Peace.